Europe's stress tests designed to end the horror show of the financial crisis.
After Italy's banks fared the worst of all Eurozone nations in financial stress tests by...
A fall in bank shares dragged down European markets on Monday.
At least 13 banks in the region would buckle under another financial crisis.
There are zombie banks everywhere, and they rule our world.
Right, zombies are being kept alive. Japan, of course, zombie country for 20 years. The banks should have been allowed to fail 20 years ago. They've been pumped up with cheap money. They're zombie banks. American banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, they should have failed long ago because they took terrible decisions and they should be bankrupt. They're insolvent. They're technically insolvent, but they were kept alive with fiat plasma that they become zombies walking the face of the earth. The French bank, Societe Generale, BNP, the walking dead.
I was working at my bank late one night when before my eyes this financial sight, my bank from its slab began to rise, and suddenly, to my surprise,
It did the bank.
It did the zombie bank.
The zombie bank.
Such a terrible stank.
We do the bank.
Once our profits have sank,
We do the bank.
we do the zombie bank.
Wahoo.
But hidden in the shadows is the nightmare the Eurozone wishes would go away: zombie banks. These are the banks that haven't been closed for fear of spreading panic in the markets. Saving them and nursing them back to health will cost billions. But leaving them to linger could cripple economies because these banks aren't strong enough to lend.
I know that the banking system is vulnerable. I tend to believe that we've got a dozen sci-fi banks. That's not science fiction. I mean, I love that. I just love that. We're talking about SIFI banks. A term was coined several years ago. It means systemically important financial institutions.
These companies are subject to the Federal Reserve's Comprehensive Capital Analysis and Review process, also known as CCAR, which is an annual quantitative evaluation of each bank's capital levels, including planned dividends and repurchases. SIFI institutions must also create and maintain a living will to explicate the process for dissolving the bank in a potential insolvency scenario. The proposed Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, currently being debated in the U.S. Senate, would raise the SIFI threshold five-fold, from $50 billion in assets to $250 billion, freeing 13 banks from the heightened level of scrutiny.
If a bank is a sci-fi bank, then everything will be done to prevent its failure because it could take down the entire banking system due to the interlinks going on and the shared derivative load. Okay, so I think we've got a few banks that are on death's doorstep, that are, being hung out on the 80th floor and hanging by tenterhooks and strings.
Deutsche Bank is in the news again with even more serious financial troubles. It is firing 18,000 workers over the next 3 years.
Deutsche Bank is the biggest bank in Germany. It is one of the biggest banks in Europe and the world. If it has serious troubles, those troubles are also affecting other banks, and they're affecting the interactions between a monster bank like Deutsche and all the other banks, since these banks do enormous amount of business with one another.
Take Deutsche Bank with a 5. You get down to where the equity becomes call option-like, it becomes derivative-like, it becomes optionality on a news event. Is Deutsche Bank right now at that point where it's an effective call option on corporate action or government action?
I mean, I'm not calling for the German government to bail out Deutsche Bank. The problem with Deutsche Bank is that the plan that they produced several months ago, while reasonable, is about 5 years too late. And so, I mean, it's possible they can solve their problems, but I think it's unlikely.
What does that mean, Steve? That they'll go bankrupt? I mean, if they don't, is this an...
You don't have to go bankrupt. You could just... I'm not predicting... I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about the bankruptcy of Deutsche Bank. It's been a slow deterioration in profitability for years, and it's probably going to continue. It's one of the things that we have learned post-crisis is that one of the hardest things for banks is to shrink yourself to profitability. And that's what they're trying to do.
Let me start with this. The word restructuring. They're using that as their argument for firing 18,000 workers. But do you buy that word?
Well, let me ask you something. Why would you need to restructure something? Do you restructure something when things are going well, when you're making a lot of profits? No, you restructure something, you repackage something, you pivot when the house is actually on fire, when the house is actually burning down.
And more, we're here in Brussels with the German Finance Minister, Olaf Scholz. So, Minister, many thanks for being with us. How close we are to a real recession?
We are not close to a real recession. We have slower growth. This is something which has to do with trade tensions worldwide. And anyone knows that if these tensions cease, we will have a completely different scenario. It is man-made problems, as Christine Lagarde said when she was the head of the IMF.
We monitor financial stability risks very carefully all of the time. It's what we do since the financial crisis, as I've mentioned before. Currently, we don't see large imbalances. This long expansion is notable for the lack of large financial imbalances like the ones we've seen certainly before the crisis happened.
What happens if this falls apart and they collapse? I mean, I know this is a big question but what's the concern?
There will be huge concern about systemic risks. What are the risks to the contagion effects within Europe? Because as we mentioned, these are derivative swaps, which means that there are a lot of interbank connectivity within Europe. Deutsche Bank right now is on the hook for $43 trillion worth of assets. So who is the other counterparty? Who is the counterparty who they would be on the line for? Those would be the guys who are asking Deutsche, hey, where is my money? This is very reminiscent to AIG and Lehman Brothers, because when AIG fell, when they went bankrupt, all the other banks were like, hey, where's my money? Well, we don't have any. Those were not mark to market.
So if the IMF/Basel gangsters claim that some banks might not survive given a recession, then I think what they're saying between their teeth is that they're at risk of failing here and now. And I don't think it's going to be possible to keep it secret. Look at the repo volume. Questions are coming up. Who's drawing on $200 billion a night now?
Somebody's going to say, are you going to bail out Goldman Sachs again, or are you going to bail out the people? And the quickest way to get to the collapse is to recruit the Federal Reserve to print money for the people. You have $22 trillion of debt overnight, go to 40, 50, 60, and all of a sudden you wake up one day and you, like me, are like, I sure am happy I taught the kids Mandarin because we've lost our reserve currency status.
If they're sci-fi banks, then you're going to get extraordinary measures overnight, all weekend long, to patch them up to fill them up with, gifts from the Department of Treasury and the Fed. There'll be suddenly Wall Street banks, helping them out. There'll be maybe some British banks helping them out. And they don't fail. They're just zombies. We don't have bank failures anymore. We have zombification. We have the creation of zombie banks. And how do you qualify a zombie bank? Well, they're insolvent, but they're in operation. And then you have to ask, well, where are they getting their funds? Where are they getting the liquidity supply? Oh, it's funny money from the Fed. So these are like intravenous intensive care ward banks, flat on their back, getting IV blood from the central bank, and they can't effing walk.
As we approach the third decade of the 21st century, at least I can hardly remember in my 25-year career in banking a more challenging time for the financial services industry. But the biggest challenge facing the European financial services industry is the persistent and structurally low interest rate environment. For more than 5 years, the euro has experienced the extraordinary situation of not just low but negative interest rates. Regarding their economic objectives, negative rates are no longer likely to be effective. With fears of a downturn mounting, we have reached a level where monetary policy is at serious risk of running out of means to cushion a real economic crisis.
Wells Fargo is reporting a nationwide outage on its website and mobile app. The company tweeted Thursday morning to apologize to customers who may be experiencing an issue. No word on the cause or how long it may last. Based on tweets, customers also appear to be having trouble with their debit card. This is the second time this month Wells Fargo customers have experienced issues. On February 1st, the company also reported an outage.
Actually, stay with us because this next one is right up your alley, too. There are millions of people breathing a sigh of relief today after Chime, which is now the biggest digital bank in the country. We've had them on this program. They're recovering after the third outage since July. This blackout left their 5 million customers stranded and unable to use their debit cards or pay bills. And this is a cohort, like we had people tweeting about not being able to pay for gas at the gas station.
The Commonwealth Bank is still trying to rectify a technical glitch that has left its customers in the dark for more than 12 hours. An error occurred early yesterday afternoon that affected payments in the CommBank app, NetBank, cardless cash transactions and BPay. The bank has this morning announced that its services are starting to recover, but is warning customers of a delay in payments appearing in their accounts.
Basically, I have this article here. This came out October 30th, okay, a couple days ago. But, it says here, Bank of America's outage panics customers. Here's what we know so far. All right, it says top line, Bank of America, the second biggest lender in the U.S., had a major outage last night that left thousands of customers around the country locked out of their accounts for over an hour without explanation.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sharice Gibson.
And I'm Karen Swenson. Tonight, Capital One customers can once again access their accounts.
I mean, imagine not being able to access your money on payday. Now, earlier this morning, Louisiana's largest bank was hit again with another major service outage.
How do I've got a 401k, I've got an IRA, I have investments. How do I protect myself from this?
Universal basic income?
Is it just buy gold and buy guns? Because
I'm sure this audience knows plenty about taking reasonable precautions with a portion of your wealth. So the number one thing I urge everybody to do is
Why? Say it! Say it!
All right, I'll say it.
Buy some productive real estate outside the United States. Buy an apartment in Buenos Aires, or buy a condominium on the beach in Uruguay, or whatever suits your fancy. Just get some assets and real estate outside the U.S. and you can put it in a trust, and you can just keep it outside the reach of the government completely. So you've got something.
Your average natural gas worker is not going to be able to buy an apartment in Buenos Aires.
He's not a subscriber either.
Well, he's
taking care of the family here, and he's not an alliance member.
Yeah.
So tough shit. And by the way, it's the underclass that keeps voting for all these retards, so they're going to get what they deserve.
Oh, dear God.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
Look, folks, before we go too far, I've got something to tell you.
Excuse me, but I've got something to tell you first. Thank you for ruining my life!
Ashley!
What did you do?
Everybody's always blaming me for everything.
There are some dire predictions that, next year, or say a year and 18 months, we have something arriving worse than 2008 and 2009. The downturn is much worse. And they'll say, it's all Trump's fault, it's all Trump's fault. No, it wasn't. 08 and 09 wasn't Obama's fault. It was the fault of the Federal Reserve. It was the fault of the Keynesian economic model, the spending too much, the deficit. So, unfortunately, there's nothing he can do. Trump can't do it. He can help, by some of these policies, but you can't avoid the correction.
We're fighting to drain the swamp, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And you see why we have to do it.
90% of the middle level of the banker cabal players have been flipped, stripped, or killed.
Wait, what are you saying? Say that again.
Remember, the middle level of the banker cabal has been largely eliminated.
Okay, by who?
So the very people who would have told that DNB Dutch official, shut up, you're not going on the air with that, you're not going public with that, we're not going to permit you to print that, go back to your office and shut up, that person is gone.
I think in light of all of the things going on, and you know what I mean by that, the fake news, the Comeys of the world, all of the bad things that went on, it's called the swamp. And you know what happened, and you know what I did? A big favor. I caught the swamp. I caught them all. Let's see what happens. Nobody else could have done that but me. I caught all of this corruption that was going on, and nobody else could have done it.
Well, today is day 2 of the BRICS summit in Brazil. The 5 leaders that make up the BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Well, they're holding bilateral meetings on a variety of topics, including increasing trade between each country. And just to give you an idea of the power that these countries have, together they represent about 42% of the world population, 23% of global GDP, 30% of the geographical territory, and 18% of global trade. Now, at these bilateral meetings, one interesting topic is being discussed, and that's developing a joint payment system in order to eventually cut their dependence on the Western financial system. The countries that make up the BRICS bloc, they're also members of the G20. Mm-hmm. So what's the driving force behind ditching the dollar, given that they're also members of the G20?
Well, because the dollar is the world reserve currency, but does not represent or protect their economies in any way. Look, Brazil, China, Russia, India, South Africa, these are nations that look at themselves as being vitally important on the world stage, and yet are completely dependent on the US dollar, and therefore the carrot and stick analogy applies here. We give you a carrot if you're good, says the U.S., or we give you the stick if you're bad, in the form of sanctions, right? And so these countries have decided we're not going to be subjected to sanctions anytime the West, or specifically the United States, wants to punish us. And the only way to do that is to break their dependency on the global system and the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
So, Ben, the new development bank created back in 2014 by the BRICS members, it was literally established to counter the IMF bank.
Yep.
Do you think that this bank is fully competing on the world stage?
Well, it's not fully competing yet, but it absolutely will get there. I mean, I certainly see the growth that's taking place there, but that was really step 1, was establishing this. Step 2 is what's being discussed now, which is the payment processing system. So really what they're competing with is the SWIFT bank system, right? So right now, if you're sending money overseas from a U.S. bank, you have to use, or any Western country, you use that SWIFT system that is set up in Belgium. And that prevents money laundering in theory and all that kind of thing. But what the BRICS nations are doing is saying, well, we don't need to use the SWIFT system because we don't want to be subjected again to U.S. sanctions, because if the U.S. is sanctioning you, you can't move money using that SWIFT system. So what's really interesting is, number one, they're creating a payment system that would go around SWIFT. But how do you do that when you have 5 major countries that all have their own currencies? And one of the ways they're doing that is by using possibly cryptocurrency to do that. That would translate their currencies into a single cryptocurrency that is then used through the system and then formulated, I guess, when it gets into their country, back into their own personal currency. So essentially you're taking currency from one, sending it through as a cryptocurrency, and then back on the other end into transforming it into another currency. And we're not doing anything about it. At this point, the U.S. is resisting on almost every level any push to change the way the system is currently, because it works for us. But it's not going to stay that way. This new system, this new way of handling currency is inevitable.
In short, the failed political class sold out American workers, sold out American prosperity, and sold out the American dream. This was the alarming situation I was elected to end. And ending it's never that easy. You see that. You do have people that want to keep it going that way, but they're losing, and they're losing now rapidly and fast. Those days are gone. And we're not going back. As you know, one of the key insights of economics is the power of incentives. Unlike past leaders, my goal is to ensure that this power works for America's favor and for America's workers and for America's companies. We want the incentives created by our tax, trade, regulatory, and energy policies to be pro-growth, pro-worker, and 100% pro-American, and more is yet to come. If we take back the House in 2020 and retain the Senate and the White House, you will see things that even this room, and you've experienced a lot of great times over the last 2.5 years, but even you will be surprised to see. We have tremendous economic potential. We have tremendous potential. We have tremendous economic potential.
Yeah, it's quite a thing to wake up one morning and find your Twitter feed getting blown up by people saying, "Isn't that your book on President Xi's shelf?" So that's pretty cool. But when we look at isolated technologies like blockchain or the smartphone, for example, we might think of these as, a data solution for the bank. Or we might think of mobile like a channel for the bank. But if you step back from those specific technologies and you look at what's happening in the world, something is changing. The world is digitizing. And the world is digitizing because we're seeking low friction and immediacy. We want immediate responses. We want stronger commerce connections that can scale up more rapidly. These are the systems that are changing globally. So within that framework, you can't expect banking and financial services to stay the same as it has been, because ultimately it has to shift. So when we look at these phases of development of banking, if you overlay technology on this, you understand that it's not just about inserting technology into banking, there's a larger shift here. Part of the shift is around trust and the utility of the bank.
There's a tremendous amount of trapped capital in corporate America, in corporate balance sheets around the world, because of latency in the payment system. What I mean by that is that banks don't want to be overdrawn in their cash management accounts, right? Because that means they're lending money. And the vast majority of companies are not investment grade companies. They'd be happy to lend money to Johnson & Johnson, but they're not happy to lend money to a small company that happens to be doing business in 10 countries around the world, right? They're going to make that company trap cash in its bank accounts so that they're never overdrawn. That trapped cash is a huge drag on the economy. And if we can speed up settlements in payments, that's going to free up a tremendous amount of cash. In my opinion, that's a much bigger advantage than the repatriation, which everybody's fighting so hard for in the tax code. Forget repatriation. Let's speed up payments to make them same day or at least T+1 in foreign exchange. That's going to free up a tremendous amount of cash for multinational companies, and the velocity of the capital on their balance sheets will improve. That makes everybody better off.
Using ODL for me as a customer has been game changer. Once you test it, I always say that I'm the biggest fan of ODL because nobody's telling me these stories. Like, I've done that myself and I've been benefited from it. You see the two screens and you see how money travels so fast, and then within the minute you have the money that you want to transfer that you were used to transferring in a week-long process, and now it costs you cents on the dollar, and it's so immediate.
I think the system is going to continue to evolve, where years ago, really, crypto was solving a little bit of illicit, kind of Silk Road and illicit use cases. Then it moved to really a speculative bubble that we saw. And I think you're going to continue to see in 2019 and 2020 and beyond the focus on utility. How are these technologies, how are these digital assets solving real problems for real customers? And absent that real utility, I don't think you're going to see the whole market grow and live up to its potential. It's the reason why Ripple has been so focused on a specific customer, a specific problem, and we've been fortunate to build a lot of momentum with that.
Deutsche Bank has real profitability issues. They haven't spent money on technology in a very, very long time.